Number 2, if anyone has a history of epilepsy, we recommend not doing this practice because we do work with the brain waves, and there is the possibility, very small, but with a history of epilepsy, that it wouldn't be a good idea. So if anybody has that going on, you have that
I had a seizure and I take medication for seizures.
You do.
It's your choice. So the last half hour is something called entrainment, which I'll tell you a lot more about later. But it's basically, it works with your brain waves to slow them down into a theta state. It's a very repetitive rhythm for a long period of time. So if you think you're going to be sensitive to that kind of rhythm, that's why we say epilepsy, is because it's very rhythmic, and especially with like pulsing light and sounds. So that's something that can trigger it.
We have light?
No.
We'll be turning down the lights, and it won't be like pulsing with it. It's just going to be the drum by itself. And if at any point you feel uncomfortable, feel free to leave at any time.
Okay.
Or you could do, if you'd like to, you could do the first part of the practice.
Yeah, you can also just stay for the discussion and the yoga portion, which is the first hour and a half. So
Okay.
if at any point you want to head out, we'll completely understand.
Okay.
From what I understand of what you're saying, I think it should be fine. It's just the pulse of the drum. So
Okay. Usually it's the lights.
Okay. Okay, and then the last thing, is there any injury or sensitivity that anyone in here would like to share with us today before we begin? Anything? Yeah.
I just have to say that I am on call for work.
Okay.
So there's a chance I might get called in, but
Okay.
so I have to leave my phone on a little bit.
Okay, so in the final part of class during the entrainment, it's nice that you're close to the door anyway.
And I'll just go low during that
Yeah.
time.
Okay, and so if that should happen, then you just kind of scoot out.
Thank you.
Okay.
Cool.
Cool. Okay, it looks like we can.
Injury-wise, what are you looking for as far as injuries?
For injuries, because I'm going to be up here doing a whole, you guys have never practiced with me before, and I know sometimes for people to really feel comfortable doing their own modifications, they want the teacher to know why they're doing it, like, oh, my wrist, so that I'm never looking at anyone wondering, oh, why aren't you doing this pose? But I'm definitely...
I may be doing my own thing.
That's perfect. I'm going to give
what we want.
right. I'm going to give another cue about that to definitely, for some people may just be seated. Oh no! What are we going to do during the discussion? May just be on their mats today during the drumming, and that's totally fine too. Some people just really love to listen to James and are like, wow, I don't want to do this yoga flow right now, and that's perfectly fine as well. So we are going to open this space as if it's a ceremony space. So we'll open it and close it in the same way. So we're going to open it with 3 breaths together, but James and I are going to go around really quick here and give you just a tiny drop of an essential oil on your hands. And once we get back to the top, we're going to rub our hands together. We're going to do 3 breaths together. So we'll just do this little tiny oil. So we're going to find a comfortable seat. It doesn't matter how you're seated, just a place that feels good. We're going to begin just by rubbing the hands together. We're going to really notice that tiny bit of heat that starts to happen there. And then from here, we're going to take a nice big inhale together. So we're going to inhale. Exhale, drop the shoulders, let it all the way out. And we're going to rub the hands together again, creating that heat, noticing that energy. We'll take a nice long inhale. Exhale. And one more time, rubbing the hands together, creating some heat. Nice long inhale. Exhale. Let it all the way out.
All right. Thank you guys so much for coming to Drumming Alive. So this is an embodiment workshop, and what we're trying to walk away with at the end of this is kind of a felt sense of embodiment, and a kind of practical way to tap into the wisdom that our bodies hold. So for those of you, I know we've got a few repeats from the festival, which we're very excited about. And for those of you who don't know, we're going to start off with about half an hour to 45 minutes of discussion. Then we're going to go into Vinyasa Yoga Flow, and then we're going to end with entrainment, which I'll touch on a bit more later. Before we get into all that, though, we'd like to start off with just letting you know our stories, so you can kind of, see why this is important to us and make any connections to your lives, and kind of make some connections there. So, my name is James. I'm going to be doing the drumming with you today. I started drumming when I was 6 years old, so I've been doing it for about 27 years now. Looking back with the lens now, I see that I really use it as a way of kind of self-healing. It was how I expressed myself. I was a really shy kid, so I was able to get my emotions out in this way because I didn't feel comfortable doing it any other way. So it was a very healing practice for me, and it very quickly became a huge passion of mine. I did it professionally for about 8 years until my band broke up when I was in my early 20s. Then fast forward a few years, and I'm in school for music and for business. But while I was in school, something happened which just dropped all the passions out of my life. My mom passed away, and when that happened, I had so much grief that I didn't know how to handle it, how to process it, that I just kind of shut everything down. So I didn't have access to my grief or my sadness, but I also didn't have access to my joy and my passions. So I kind of shut off the body, which brought me up into my headspace, and I kind of lived in my head for quite a few years. So while I was kind of in that headspace, avoiding like the feelings that I had here, I basically kind of made a checklist in my head of all the things I thought I wanted. So success and money and notoriety and all these things. So after I graduated college, I got a job at a tech company in Chicago, and I worked my way up, kind of achieving these goals one by one. And every time I hit a goal, I kind of thought, this is kind of where I wanted to be. This is where I should be feeling fulfilled and happy, right? And I wasn't. So then I realized, oh, okay, maybe it's the next goal. And then I would get there, and again, I wasn't happy. So I was climbing this ladder, and it took me all the way to kind of my top goal, where I kind of made it to a leadership position in a pretty big tech company. When I looked at myself, and I realized, okay, this is like everything I wanted. I have like the money and everything. I'm like successful. This is it, and I don't feel good. I don't feel like I am doing like good stuff for the world. I don't feel like fulfilled within. So then I have to look at myself a little more, or a little harder. And when I did that, a lot of things started coming into my life, like yoga, mindfulness practices, and I really started looking within. And I decided to leave the position that I was at. And when I did that, I kind of let go of all these things that I've been holding on to so tightly for my whole life. All these things that I thought that I wanted. And then, as tends to happen, when I let go, it all kind of fell apart. So all the things that I had kind of identified myself with were gone. And when that happened, I was able to kind of start clearing out the rubble and really start looking within. And I found myself in South America with Tila, and while I was there, really trying to drop into my body, and we were doing a lot of deep work together, I started seeing that all these passions, which I had thought I had lost, they were still in there, but they were these little seedlings that I had to nurture, so I could feel them, and I could, little things would start popping up one by one as I started going deeper. So as I did that, I became reacquainted with the drum. I started getting into shamanic drumming practices, sonic healing, and a lot of these things. And I started seeing how all these different facets of my life that seemed so separate were actually the perfect combination for where I was at that time to bring it together into some like a more holistic life. So then we came back to the States, and we started kind of doing these workshops and teaching these things, because the drum and this embodiment practice is what brought me back to like a passionate and fulfilled and an actual life, rather than just kind of living without living. So that's why it's important to me, and that's why I'm here.
Yes. Nice. So James is going to tell us more about the entrainment and stuff in just a bit, but I'll tell you a little bit about my story. So I actually met James when I was 16 and he was 17. He was my very first boyfriend, and we dated for a month, and I thought for sure I was going to marry him, but then he went to college and we ended up breaking up, but we stayed friends for 14 years. So I had the privilege of watching James as he's moved through and around and over his path, and as he kind of dealt with his grief and went through all of that. So James and I have known each other for a long time. In the last 3 years, we've partnered up again in romance and in work and business and stuff like that. So James is actually from Caledonia, Minnesota. He always forgets to say that, but I think it's important kind of because we can see you guys probably have relatives in Minnesota, or maybe you're even from there. I'm from Lansing, Iowa, so northeast Iowa, right on the river. My story is similar to James's in some ways. I started off as well just on a really traditional path. I went to college, I got a 4-year degree, I applied for a master's program. I as well was really in this headspace, like really wanting to achieve, and like almost had this list of, okay, these are the things that you need to do to be successful and almost correct as a human being. And so I was going through that list, and I was doing a pretty good job at it, I will say. I got to a point where I got into a master's program that I was really excited about, but in between the master's program and my undergrad program, I decided to take a year off and do, well, not really a year off, a year to pad my resume more for some reason. Even though I'd already gotten in the program, I was that much in my head about how can I make myself better. And so here I was, I found myself in Peru. I was going to do some research on autism. At the time, I was a neurobiological research assistant. And so I decided to go to Peru and do some more research. But like life often has it, what I thought I was doing wasn't really what ended up happening. So I arrived in Peru, and I always kind of get to a loss of words at this point because I don't know if there are really words for it, but something either about the vibration of the land or the way that people carry themselves shifted something in me. So even the first few days that I was there, I felt something shifting. It was like I had gone my whole life reading a book about this is how to be human, this is how you eat, this is what you should do to be good, and all of a sudden it was like someone just slapped that book out of my hands, and I looked down and I was like, holy crap, I am a human being. Like, I am living this experience. It's available to me right now. And so I had a huge shift that even at that time my body temperature was even 2 degrees less than it is now. So it was a shift that was really visceral. It was like I just came online in a way that moved so much of who I was. And so needless to say, I get back to the States and I'm like, holy cow, I can't stop thinking about this experience. Within 6 months, I had relocated to South America. I dropped my grad program. My parents were like, oh, like what has happened? Like James said, like everything fell away. So much of the stuff I identified with fell away. And I spent the next 6 years in South America. So there's a little bit more to this story. So I get to South America, and my main thing is, how do I find more of what I found here in the first place? How do I find more of that heart-centered, whole body feeling? And so, like, what often happens as well is when you really commit to something, it seems that those things, anything standing in the way of you and that commitment just comes up as a way to really help you get there. But at the time, sometimes it can feel like just a speed bump that's a little bit too high almost, where you're like, holy cow. So I get to South America, I'm on this mission, and one day I go to the beach, and I come back, and I'm feeling pretty good. I'm feeling like, okay, I'm doing it. And I go to put some lip balm on, and I go to put my lips together, and they wouldn't go together. I actually thought at the time that it was really funny. This is strange. So I go into the bathroom, and I look at my face to see what's going on, and I blinked, but only one of my eyes blinked. So it turned out that I had a condition called Bell's palsy. A lot of you have probably heard of it. It's pretty common. Many of you may have had the condition yourselves or had a loved one who's dealt with it. And so here I am in South America. Already so much of my identity has kind of fallen away. And the only thing that I had left at that point was really my face, because I wasn't speaking Spanish that well, so I was using my expressions to really get by. And now all of a sudden I can't say my P's and my B's. I'm drooling. I have to wear a patch over my eye. It's just this complete loss of identity. So here I am in this foreign country, and I'm just thinking to myself, like, what? Well, after Googling a lot, and yes, I did go to a doctor. So it wasn't as if I just like let the whole thing go. But after that, there's nothing that, for Bell's palsy, there's nothing really that you can do about it. Most of the time, you'll regain function, but not always. So it's kind of a waiting game. And so at that point, I decided to just get really quiet with myself and kind of turn inward. There was nothing else I could do anyway, since I couldn't really communicate externally anyway. And so here I was getting really, really quiet with myself. And I would say after about a week, something that seemed at the time miraculous happened. It was like I had my ear up to the voice of my body, and all of a sudden, I started to hear and really feel the voice of my body in a way that always makes me so excited, because it was so real, and it is so real. It was like I could all of a sudden feel how excited all of my cells were to be here with me and allowing me to express myself, allowing my soul here to show up. It was like I could hear these little cheerleaders with so much love, wanting so much for me to be able to move about and express myself here on this planet. And so what happened then were two things. One, I ended up having a grieving process, because all of a sudden I realized I had spent at least 2 decades just being so harsh with my body and not treating it right, so much disrespect, almost like really bordering on abuse, the way that we treat our physical forms in this society. And so I was grieving, and I was trying to find a way to forgive myself. And then the second thing that happened is that I realized that the deeper that I went within my own body, and the more I listened to these small sensations, this small voice, it was like I could go through different doors within myself and different windows within myself. And I started to, the rhythm of my own body started to sync up with the rhythm of the moon. And I started to understand the planet's rhythm in a different way. And everything changed for me. And so it was at that time that I decided that I wanted to figure out how to bring this to other human beings, specifically women. So I've worked the last 5 years doing embodiment work, mostly with women, but also with some men, helping people to come back into contact with the voice of their body and to really feel just how much our physical form loves us. So that's my story, that's James's story. We're going to do a little exercise right now. Each one of you has got a coin that we put at the top of your mat. We're going to grab the little coin, and those of you who have done this, who have been at our other workshops, have already know, but we've had, it's funny, sometimes we put these coins out and we've had people just like, put them in their pocket right away or whatever. And then it's embarrassing when we're like, take your coin out, and they're like, oh, okay, it's okay. So we're going to take our coin out. We're going to ask ourselves a question. So we are going to ask ourselves a should I question that could have a yes or no answer. So this could be like, should I ask for a raise? Should I quit my job? Should I get another dog? So we can take a second to just come up with a should I question. Maybe something that's been weighing on you. Once we come up with the question, we're going to give our coin a little flip or a little toss, and we'll do heads yes and tails no. So, notice how you felt or feel in your body when you saw the answer. Did you feel excited? Did you have a little bit of a feeling in your stomach or in your heart? Or did you droop? Or did you maybe straighten a little bit? So this exercise has nothing to do with what the coin actually said, and everything to do with the way that you felt when you saw the answer. And so it's so often that we bring questions exclusively to our headspace and we don't consult the rest of who we are. And so we're just like, it's almost like, imagine only using one organ. If we would only use our spleen to make all of our decisions. The brain wasn't meant for us to make all of the decisions from that place. It's an information gathering thing. And then we bring it to all of who we are and see what happens. So James likes to use this example of like, if you've ever been in a car with your family or something, and if somebody asks where you want to eat, and then you say you don't care, and then they choose somewhere, and you're like, oh, gross. You know, you all of a sudden are like, realize that that's not actually what you wanted. But since we're so used to bringing everything to this headspace and from moving only from here, we end up creating a life that makes a ton of sense to our mind, but doesn't quite make sense to the rest of who we are. So this is where we're going to talk a little bit about what is embodiment, what does it mean to be embodied. So we all probably know someone, or maybe are someone, who's created a life that if we were to write it down on paper, it would make complete sense. And it would seem like they were doing the right thing and a good job, but for some reason, something just felt off. Maybe they felt a little bit lost, maybe even a sense of loneliness, or as James said, like no enthusiasm. And so this is what happens when we make all of our decisions from the space of our head. We create a life that makes sense to our minds, but it doesn't make sense to the rest of who we are. So imagine now that we have an entire society we're basically, I would say at least 90% of our Western society is disembodied. And so it's as if we're all these walking heads. We've gone around and we've created an entire culture that makes sense to the head, but something just doesn't feel right. And what's interesting about the way the body speaks is that it doesn't speak in words or an entire paragraph. So many of us have this feeling that we can't put words to, but if we can't put words to it, we think we should just dismiss it. So we're all kind of feeling a little bit of something that we're not quite oftentimes either taking seriously because there aren't exact words to it. And so I think that this is why oftentimes when from our Western society we end up traveling like to South America or a place where it seems like it doesn't make sense to us sometimes that the people have so little but they're so happy. And so we see how that it just doesn't make sense. Well, it may not make sense to just this, but those people are more connected with all of who they are. So they are having a life that makes a whole lot more sense to all of who they are as a human being. So that's a little bit about what it means to be embodied. Oh, and another, I like to use this analogy. So it's as if we're like the society of walking heads. But the good news is we can never really leave our bodies behind. Really thank God, because I think a lot of us would do that if we could. But we cannot, and that is awesome. Because we can imagine, like, let's say we're at a concert and the music is really loud, and our friend is trying to tell us something, and all of a sudden the music cuts, and our friend is screaming. And we hope she's not screaming anything ridiculous, like happens depending on which friend it is usually. So we can imagine that that music is like our mind or our brain. So it's really loud. And then the friend is the voice of our body. So it's trying to say something, but what happens is because the music never shuts off, the friend ends up having to scream. And so this ends up manifesting itself as like chronic pain or chronic disease or even fatigue and even sometimes numbness, where the body is really trying to tell us something. And it's very likely that the body began at a much quieter voice. But because we couldn't hear, she ended up, or he ended up, having to scream. And so that's when we find ourselves also in like an emergency. So I like to talk about embodiment as well as a way to move your life from just a series of like emergencies where you find yourself in a place where you're like, how did this happen? I'm up against a wall. Maybe I just lost my job or was just diagnosed with something that makes no sense. It's an emergency situation. We can kind of move from that style of living to instead emerging with kind of the voice of our body. So if we were to listen to our body, even imagine like the chair you use at your office. How comfortable is it? So it may just be something really subtle where we're like, this doesn't quite feel right, but we ignore it. And then we ignore it for years, and then we ignore it for a decade. And all of a sudden we end up having something that's like, how did this happen? Well, it's just these little tiny cues that the body is giving us that could allow us to more quickly emerge. So our life is more full of this grace and ease rather than like hitting a corner and not kind of knowing how that happened. So I'm going to talk a little bit now about how we become disembodied. I think we could really start at infancy in our culture, but maybe an easier place to start is imagine